When the red paint splashed across Master Sergeant Harold Becker's medals, it didn't just stain his uniform, it tested the soul of a nation. At 74, Harold didn't flinch. He stood silent, shoulders square, eyes forward, while a crowd looked on in shock. In a world quick to react and quicker to forget, Harold reminded us of something we're in danger of losing: honor. Not loud, not vengeful, just steady. In that single, still moment, one man became the living embodiment of every vow whispered under a flag, every name etched in stone, every promise that freedom demands a price. This isn't just the story of a veteran. It's the story of what happens when dignity is attacked and legacy answers. The protester's voice trembled with fury as he screamed, "That uniform is a costume for killers." A second later, a can of red paint flew from his hand, fast, deliberate, and vengeful. It tore through the crisp Texas air and exploded against the chest of Master Sergeant Harold "Red" Becker. The vibrant paint splattered across his pristine blues, soaking into the fabric, desecrating decades of service with one violent splash. Red didn't flinch. Not a blink. Not a sound. The paint dripped down his medals like blood, staining the careful creases of his pressed uniform. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. A city official instinctively reached toward him, but Becker lifted one hand slightly, stopping him without a word. Then, with the calm of a man who'd lived through storms most couldn't imagine, he closed his eyes. Just for a second, as if he was hearing a voice from a place no one else could reach anymore. A voice only he remembered. Behind him, the crowd began to stir. Confusion, anger, rising unrest. The protester grinned, proud of his moment. That was when Harold quietly reached into his pocket and flipped open his old cell phone. Not to call the police, not to call for help. He called something older, something deeper. Moments later, the ground trembled. And when the Marines showed up, they didn't bring banners or speeches. They brought boots, steel, and silence. Harold "Red" Becker never had to announce what he was. You could see it in the way he moved, upright, steady, as though each step still carried weight. At 74, his body bore the years, but not the surrender. His shoulders were squared like always, his boots still gleamed, and his movements were deliberate, disciplined, filled with the quiet strength of a man who had never stopped serving. He lived alone in a simple, one-story brick house on the edge of Kerrville, Texas. No grand signs of his past. No American flag flapping on a tall pole. No wall of honors. Just a neat porch with a swing that barely moved, and a Marine Corps decal on the old mailbox, sun-bleached and nearly worn off. His home, like the man, didn't demand attention. But those who knew the town, they knew exactly who Harold Becker was. He never brought up his medals unless someone directly asked. And even then, he'd brush them off like they were novelty tokens picked up on some long road trip. But behind that modesty lived a man who had seen and done more than most. 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 deployments during the Gulf, a Bronze Star with valor, a Purple Heart tucked away inside a small wooden box next to a weathered photo of the comrades he'd never stopped missing. They called him Red, not because of his hair, but because of what happened on a mission that nearly took his life. He carried 2 wounded Marines through a hail of gunfire. By the time the chopper landed, his uniform was soaked in blood from head to boots. And still, he didn't let go. Even after retiring, Harold didn't fade quietly into the background. He spent every week mentoring at the local high school's Reserve Officer Cadet program. Every Sunday, he was at the VFW Hall. And on every day that meant something. Memorial Day, Veterans Day, the 4th of July, he was there. Dressed in full blues, shoes shined to a mirror sheen. He always said it wasn't for himself. It was for the ones who never came back, the ones who couldn't stand in their own uniforms anymore. His knees hurt. Years of parachute jumps and battlefield marches had worn them down. His right hip never fully healed after a hard crash during training in Okinawa. But he never complained. Never once. When it came time to place the wreath at the memorial, he did it alone. No cane, no assistance. Just him, steadfast, silent, and moving with the solemn dignity of a man carrying more than flowers. The town never asked him to do it. He just did. He was the kind of man who quietly held the fabric of a community together. You wouldn't notice it unless you paid close attention. But if you did, you'd start to see the threads. Every young Marine who left that town made sure to shake his hand before they shipped out. And when they came back, their first stop wasn't always home. More often than not, it was Harold's porch. Because respect knows its own. Maplewood Park wasn't much. Just a humble patch of green tucked behind City Hall, lined with flagpoles and anchored by a granite memorial etched with the names of the town's fallen sons and daughters. But on Veterans Day, it became hallowed ground. By mid-morning, folding chairs had been set out in neat rows. The high school band stood in mismatched maroon blazers, brass instruments glinting under the Texas sun. Veterans filled the front rows, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes or each other. Behind them, families gathered, many wearing old ball caps embroidered with names and numbers from wars long past. Small flags waved quietly in their hands. At the center of it all stood Harold Red Becker. His uniform looked like it had been pressed by angels. Crisp, unwrinkled, every ribbon perfectly aligned. Brass buttons sparkled. His gloves were white. His shoes shone like polished mirrors. And he stood tall, still as stone, posture held with the kind of grace and dignity you can't teach, only earn. He didn't like speeches, said he was never much of a talker. But this year, he'd agreed to stand as the guest of honor. Said it didn't feel right, that he didn't deserve it. But the mayor had insisted. The principal of the high school had come personally to shake his hand. His own father had served alongside Harold in '68. The ceremony began. The mayor read from a wrinkled sheet of paper, voice careful and reverent. The band played America the Beautiful. It was slightly off-key, but played with every bit of heart. There was a prayer, a slow, solemn roll call of the fallen. Then came the wreath-laying, and that's when the shouting began. A group of a dozen protesters had gathered beyond the wrought iron fence, signs held high and bold. War is not honor, no more blood for power. Uniforms are not sacred. Some wore masks, others had their phones raised, already live streaming. Their chants grew louder, angrier, hovering just shy of crossing the line. The police were present but passive. They stood nearby, unsure, their presence restrained and uneasy. Harold didn't move, his eyes remained forward, hands clasped behind his back, still as ever. But the tension in the air, it was sharp enough to cut. In the crowd, tension rippled like a shiver down the spine of the city. A young mother instinctively pulled her child closer to her side. One of the older veterans leaned toward the person beside him, murmuring something low and grim beneath his breath. The high school marching band, mid-chorus just moments ago, fell silent, notes frozen mid-air. And what followed was not reverence but a fragile, shivering stillness. Everyone could feel it, like the atmosphere before a lightning storm. The pressure changed. Most people just hoped it would pass quietly, that the shouting protesters would lose steam and leave. But Harold Becker had seen too many battles to mistake the stillness for peace. He could smell the break before it happened. The sound of taps drifted through the late November air, slow, mournful, and final. The bugler stood near the war memorial, cheeks puffing with effort, notes echoing against the statues in stone. Flags nearby barely stirred in the breeze. Even the protest group had gone quiet for the moment, as if the sacred music pulled them back from the edge. Then it happened. At the far edge of the temporary fencing, movement broke the silence. A figure stepped forward, younger than most in the protest crowd. Couldn't have been more than 25. He wore a black hoodie, his jaw sharp, his gaze cutting through the air, not with grief, but with fire, rage. He pushed past another protester, someone who reached out, maybe trying to stop him, but the young man jerked away and kept moving, purposeful and fast. He stepped across the small lawn, heading straight for the platform where the wreath lay. Security, if you could call it that, consisted of two elderly city volunteers wearing oversized orange vests. They saw what was happening a beat too late. No one had expected violence, especially not during taps. The young man marched forward with determination. In one hand, hidden halfway beneath his sleeve, was a small silver can. Any house painter would have recognized it. A spray can. Still, the bugler played on, oblivious. The protester didn't shout at first. He waited until he was just feet away from the memorial, close enough to smell the polish on the old veteran's shoes. to feel the crunch of autumn leaves underfoot. Then, in a voice sharpened by fury, he screamed, cutting through the final trailing note of taps. "That uniform is a murderer's costume!" The crowd spun in unison, heads jerking toward the voice. The mayor's mouth dropped open. A startled voice from the audience yelled, "Hey!" But it was too late. With a violent flick of his wrist, the young man hurled the can. It spun once midair, then exploded. The red paint arced forward like blood. It splattered squarely onto Harold Becker's chest. The impact landed with a slap and a splatter, sending thick streams of red streaking across Harold's neatly pressed dress blues. The paint smeared his polished ribbons, dripped over his leather belt, and soaked into the wool hem of his coat. Crimson rivers ran down his row of polished buttons and pooled on the toes of his shine-black shoes. The metals he'd painstakingly polished that morning now hung, dulled and dripping with insult. The crowd gasped in unison. A child began crying. One of the veterans growled low in his throat. The mayor stood frozen, hand lifted halfway to his chest. A few people instinctively reached for their phones, already filming. But Harold didn't move. He remained upright, eyes fixed forward, posture locked in full attention. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He didn't even reach up to wipe the cold liquid now trailing down his neck and into his collar. Instead, he closed his eyes. Just for a second. It wasn't exhaustion. It was something older, something buried deeper. Memory, maybe, or mourning, like he could hear something no one else could, a whisper of voices lost long ago, names never carved into stone but etched into his blood. The protester raised his fist triumphantly. "No more killers in uniform," he shouted as two elderly volunteers finally surged forward. He didn't run, didn't resist. He let them grab his arms and haul him away, wearing a grin of pure defiance, like a man convinced he had just won something larger than the moment. Around them, silence pulsed again, this time sharp and hollow. The bugler lowered his trumpet. City officials looked stunned, powerless. The veterans in the front row stood slowly, their bodies stiff, their eyes blazing. And that's when Harold moved. Not to yell, not to retaliate. He slipped one hand into the inner pocket of his paint-soaked jacket and drew out something strange, something that didn't belong in the modern world. A military-issued flip phone, gray, scratched, sturdy, an artifact from another lifetime, with a stubby antenna and a small black and white screen. It didn't even have a regular number, just a direct line, a military protocol known only to a small number of men still living. Harold flipped it open. The familiar snap rang like a trigger. He hadn't used that phone in years, not since his last reunion with the Corps during a joint training and exercise at Camp Lejeune. This phone wasn't for idle talk. It was a lifeline for moments no one ever thought would come. His thumb hovered for half a second. Then he pressed and held the one button that mattered. The line didn't ring. There was no hold music, no automated voice, just a tone. And then a voice. Calm and sharp, unmistakably military. U.S. Command Liaison. Identification? Harold's voice was firm, not a tremor in it. Master Sergeant Harold Becker, code Alpha 74, retired status. He took a breath. Harold drew in a shallow breath, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. Reporting protocol breach. Veteran ceremony. Public assault on uniform. Civilians present. Local security ineffective. On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Just a breath, then a shift in tone. Confirm intent. Harold didn't flinch. Honor compromised. That phrase, simple, quiet, was the old signal, the one reserved for rare, sacred moments. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't for headlines. It was the code reserved for when something sacred had been defiled, when a veteran stood alone, and symbols meant to be revered were spit on in plain view. In that world Harold once belonged to, honor compromised meant one thing. The Corps would still answer. Location, came the reply. Maplewood Park, Kerrville, Texas. High civilian presence. Suspect in custody. Civil unrest likely. The line came alive. Keys tapped rapidly in the background. Then the voice returned, no longer procedural, now personal. Master Sergeant Becker, this is Major Elias Talanda, Active Liaison Command, 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. We're running training ops less than 20 miles east. We're moving now. Harold blinked, absorbing the words, the tone. How many assets? Talen answered immediately. Sufficient to ensure presence, protection, and principle. ETA under 10 minutes. You'll know when we arrive. Harold gave a single nod to the open air, more to himself than to the man on the other end. Appreciate the speed. You called it, Master Sergeant, Talen said. We just answer. Then the line went dead. No goodbyes, no need for one. Harold shut the flip phone slowly, almost reverently, and slipped it back into the chest pocket of his paint-splattered jacket. Around him, the ceremony remained frozen in a fractured stillness. The protester who had hurled the paint now sat cuffed on the curb, flanked by shaken volunteers and one exhausted city officer trying to call for backup. The mayor, pale and shaken, whispered anxiously to a councilwoman who pointed helplessly at the defaced memorial wreath. The crowd had splintered into nervous clusters, some fuming, others stunned, yet all unsettled. But Harold stood rooted, silent, still. Only he knew what had just happened. The quiet had changed. It wasn't the hollow silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of anticipation. Because Harold hadn't called for help. He had called for honor. And in the world he once walked in uniform, that word still carried weight. It meant boots. It meant steel. It meant the Marines were coming. At first it was only a murmur, so low it blended with the wind. Most people didn't notice. Conversations hummed, arguments continued. A few folks offered Harold words of comfort he didn't acknowledge. But the sound grew. Louder, rhythmic, intentional. A low, steady thrum that pricked the ears of those who had once heard it before. Two children stopped mid-play and looked up. Above the rooftops of downtown Kerrville, the sky darkened slightly, the clouds parting just enough to reveal two dark shapes slicing through the morning air. Marine UH-1Y helicopters, flying low and with absolute purpose. Their rotors beat the sky like war drums. They didn't hover. They didn't wait. They announced. In a matter of seconds, the town shifted. Traffic lights swung. Newspapers flew from benches. Every set of eyes turned toward the heavens. Then came the convoy. From every feeder road leading into the square, military vehicles rolled in, gritty, growling, unstoppable. These weren't the familiar shapes of police cruisers or National Guard trucks. These were Marine Corps tactical machines, the real ones, the kind that left tracks in foreign deserts and jungles and returned home bearing the weight of things civilians would never understand. MRAPs, Humvees, LAV-25s. Engines roared like restrained beasts, tires gripping pavement with authority. There were no sirens. None were needed. 8 minutes. That's all it took for the entire town to feel different. City buses pulled aside. Drivers stepped out of their vehicles. Store owners emerged onto sidewalks, phones held high. Windows opened along the second floors of brick buildings as shopkeepers and residents leaned out to see. And then, boots, the sound of them, striking pavement in perfect timing. Rows of Marines in full combat utilities, flanked by helmets, flak vests strapped snug, service rifles held at patrol-ready position. Their barrels pointed low, but they were unmistakably present. They didn't bark orders. They didn't make a scene. They simply moved. A wall of calm precision, forming a full perimeter around the park, around the crowd, around the memorial. They weren't here to escalate. They were here to remind. The message needed no words. The Kerrville Police Department sergeant, a young woman with tension behind her eyes, stepped toward the lead Marine, her hands raised slightly in peace. Sir, we weren't informed of this. The Marine officer, face calm and unreadable, replied evenly, We're not here to interfere, ma'am. We're here to protect what's already been assaulted. She looked at him for a long second. Then she stepped back. No one had to explain what was happening anymore. Even those who had cheered the protesters' actions stood mute now. The signs had dropped. The smug defiance had drained. No one shouted. No one smirked. Because standing around them now was an unbroken wall of disciplined force. 360 degrees of solemn presence. The young man who had thrown the paint, he was already gone. But what he'd done, that was still echoing. And this This wasn't retaliation. This wasn't violence. It was remembrance. It was resolve. And it was the United States Marine Corps answering a call that wasn't written in any current protocol. But in the hearts of the men who had once worn the uniform, it was carved into bone. Harold Becker didn't flinch. Retired or not, the uniform he wore wasn't just fabric stitched into a suit. It was history, sacrifice, and blood. And it wasn't something to be disrespected, least of all on a day meant to honor the fallen. He stood steady in his stained dress blues, silent as the circle of Marines gradually closed in around him, not as a show of force, but of quiet solidarity. He didn't need to speak. His stillness said everything. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't revenge. It was about a truth deeper than words. Some symbols don't fall quietly, and some men never stand alone. The entire park seemed to still as the last vehicle in the military convoy rolled to a stop at the far edge of Maplewood Park. The matte black Marine MRAP's rear door opened slowly. Out stepped a man whose very presence turned heads and quieted murmurs. Colonel Jonathan McCabe didn't need an introduction. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't here for photo ops or interviews. Every movement he made carried precision and meaning, adjusting his gloves, scanning the perimeter with practiced eyes, his boots pressing into the earth with unhurried, commanding weight. The morning sun caught on the eagle, globe, and anchor insignia pinned to his chest. As he walked through the ranks of Marines, they parted for him without a word. His authority wasn't granted by ceremony, it was earned in fire. At the center of the memorial, he came to a stop, standing directly across from Harold Becker. The red paint was still vivid across Harold's chest, staining his medals, soaking into the lapels. Colonel McCabe didn't speak. Instead, he stood at rigid attention and lifted a salute, flawless, unwavering, and held a breath longer than regulation required. Harold returned the gesture, slow, measured, full of gravity. Then the colonel addressed the crowd, not just Harold, but the entire town. His voice wasn't loud, but it was ironclad, each word carrying the weight of centuries of duty and sacrifice. This uniform is not a target, he began. It is a legacy. It represents the service and sacrifice of every man and woman who stood when others ran, who bled so others wouldn't have to, who kept their oath long after the war ended. He paused, letting that truth anchor itself in the air. When you strike one of us, he said, you strike all of us. Silence held its breath. Then he turned to the crowd, scanning faces, speaking not just to the townspeople, but to the cameras, the headlines already forming. This community came together today to honor its veterans. What happened here, this act of violence and disgrace, will not go unanswered. Not by this Corps, not on this soil, not today. Just then, one of the Marines stepped forward and handed him a report. McCabe read it quickly, then looked toward the far side of the street, where local officers stood with the protester in custody. The individual who carried out the assault has been apprehended. He will face full charges, including assault and hate-based enhancements, for targeting a decorated veteran during a ceremonial event. Across the street, the once loud protest group had thinned, their energy drained the moment the convoy arrived. One member stood trembling in front of a local news camera, holding a printed statement and shaking hands. His voice faltered as he read it. We do not condone violence or personal attacks. This individual acted alone. His actions do not reflect our values. But it was too late. The damage wasn't just physical, it was moral, symbolic. Their credibility fractured alongside the silence they had shattered earlier that morning. At the edge of the ceremony space, Mayor Gilbreth, flushed, disheveled, beads of sweat on his forehead, clutched a stack of wrinkled notes as he stepped to the hastily erected podium. His voice trembled. On behalf of the city of Coralville, he began, I want to publicly apologize to Master Sergeant Harold Becker, to every veteran present here today, and to the United States Marine Corps. We failed to protect this sacred space. That failure will not be repeated. He turned to look at Harold, but had nothing more to add. Quietly, he stepped back. No applause followed. No cheers, just solemn silence. Because some moments aren't meant to be celebrated. They demand reverence. This was one of them. A reckoning, both raw and necessary. By evening, footage of the incident had been shared more than 4 million times. One video showed the exact moment the red paint exploded across Harold's uniform. Another caught the deafening chop of a helicopter slicing through the sky just minutes later. Cell phone streams captured the solemn wall of Marines forming around Maplewood Park. It was everywhere. Social media exploded with headlines. Veteran doused in paint. Marines respond in force. Symbol of honor defiled. A town watches. Protester targets Marine. What happened next shocked the nation. Colonel McCabe's brief pointed words, "The uniform is not a target, it is a legacy," became a viral soundbite. Talk shows ran the clip. News outlets looped it. Commentators debated everything: free speech, military presence in public spaces, the ethics of protest, and the deeper meaning of honor in a changing country. The conversation fractured the nation. Civil rights advocate has warned about the creeping edge of authoritarianism, the militarization of civic life. But veterans, military families, and everyday Americans pushed back just as forcefully. They spoke of a culture that had forgotten the cost of peace, of lives quietly spent serving causes larger than themselves, regardless of the politics behind the wars they fought. Twitter became a battleground. You can't just send in troops because someone got offended. He didn't get offended, he got assaulted in full dress uniform on Memorial Day. The story didn't fade. It ignited something, painful, unresolved, and overdue. He wore a brand new set of dress blues sent straight from the commandant's office at Quantico, tailored to perfection, every button polished, every crease sharp. His medals caught what little morning light filtered through the clouds. They didn't sparkle. They stood, silent and steady, like the man who bore them. Harold Becker didn't come for applause. He didn't come to be seen. He came because he always had. Just like every year before, just like every memory etched into the stone beneath his boots. He walked the path slowly, his steps steady but deliberate, as if each one measured something deeper than distance. Past the rows of granite, past the names weathered by time and rain and memory. He stopped at the same spot where it all had happened, where the protester's voice had cracked with anger, where someone had dared call his uniform a costume for killers. He didn't flinch then. He didn't flinch now. Instead, he stood still. Again. No cameras, no crowd, just a few scattered birds, the faint hum of cars in the distance, and the rustling of old flags reclaiming their dignity. The protest had been loud, brutal in its disrespect, but it was Harold's silence that spoke louder. And it was that silence, unshaken, deliberate, that reached across the country. Veterans groups filled social media with their own stories. Snapshots of service, dress uniforms worn with pride, messages sent across generations. Most signed simply, "From one old Marine to another." Some shared the weight they'd carried for decades. One post read, "Bushamaji." Back in '72, someone spit on my uniform at the airport. I didn't fight back either. I just kept walking. But I wish Harold Becker had been there then. Sergeant Glenn Hart, Master Sergeant Sear Fee, Dana Maxwell, names poured in. Their voices didn't shout. They remembered. "You reminded us," one post said, "that sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the heaviest burden." Through it all, Harold stayed quiet. He didn't accept interviews. Not from CNN camped outside his home, or from the local paper that had covered his deployments years ago. His porch light stayed off. His phone stayed silent. Because to Harold, this wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about one thing: protecting what mattered. He made one appearance, and only one, the following Friday at the local VFW post. No press, no lights, just folding chairs and a room lined with aging black and white photos, their frames crooked, but full of history. Harold stepped up to the microphone, not to give a speech, not to read a statement. He simply looked out at the faces in that room, faces that had seen the same deserts, the same jungles, the same flag-draped caskets, and said, "They say the world's changing. Maybe it is, but honor doesn't change. And as long as one of us remembers what that uniform stands for, then they haven't erased a thing." Then he sat back down, folded his hands, and listened as the room rose to its feet, not with clapping, not with cheering, but with silence. The kind of silence that honors. The story didn't fade after the headlines moved on. If anything, it grew. Harold Becker's stillness that day, His quiet refusal to react in anger became a moment people returned to, a spark of something old. In less than a month, a bipartisan bill was introduced in Congress, the Veterans Public Honor Protection Act. It didn't come from a lobbyist or think tank. It came from a small-town mayor's public apology, from one veteran's stillness in a storm. The bill proposed stricter penalties for assaults on uniformed veterans during official commemorative events and provided funding to municipalities to ensure proper security during high-risk days like Veterans Day and Memorial Day. It passed the House with overwhelming support. At the state level, something just as powerful unfolded. A coalition of veterans launched a grassroots movement called Honor Watch. The mission was simple: form a nationwide volunteer network of veterans who would attend public ceremonies, not to intimidate, not to police, but to stand shoulder to shoulder, to show that no one who served would ever again stand alone before a memorial. Each volunteer was given a red pin etched with one word: remember. The first chapter formed right there in Kerrville. Harold Becker didn't ask to lead it, but they named him honorary captain anyway. And every year since, no matter the weather, a quiet formation of old Marines, airmen, and sailors gathers behind the memorial at Maplewood Park. They rarely speak. They don't need to. Their presence is the message. But perhaps the most touching tribute didn't come from Washington or the Corps. It came from the children. After the protest, it was noticed that the park's granite memorial had begun to fade. The paint on the names chipped. Some were barely readable. The years had done their work. And quietly, without city funding or any formal announcement, the local middle school art teacher organized a weekend repainting effort. Dozens of students came. Many had been there that day when it all happened. Some brought their parents. A few wore ROTC caps. They weren't told what to write. But when the paint dried, just beneath the engraved phrase, "Freedom is never free," one simple line appeared in gold: "We saw him stand, we won't forget." That phrase would later appear on bumper stickers, coffee mugs, and plaques sent to VFW posts around the country. But in Kerrville, it remained as the kids had left it: hand-painted, uneven, imperfect, and somehow more sacred for it. Harold Becker never called himself a hero, but by choosing not to react, by simply standing still, he reignited something this country had been missing, something quiet, something old, something called honor, polished to a mirror finish. The uniform had been returned, not as a replacement, but as a recognition. It wasn't meant to fix anything, to erase or overwrite what had happened. It was an acknowledgement, a silent salute from those who understood. Along with the uniform came a single letter from the Corps. No long explanation, no medals or ceremony. Just one line: "Your silence spoke louder than any command." Signed, Seer Fidelis. Harold Becker stood before the memorial, a place that had always held a quiet reverence, but today felt heavier, more intimate. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if his boots still remembered the weight of years and miles walked in service. The memorial had changed since he'd last been here. New coats of paint softened the stone's edges, fresh flowers had been planted with care, and a crisp American flag stood tall, rippling slightly in the breeze. Taller than before, it seemed. Straighter. With one hand gloved in soft leather, Harold reached out and ran his fingers across the granite wall. He paused at a name, just one, among so many. A name that still echoed in his bones, a fellow Marine, a friend whose laugh he could still remember, though time had blurred the edges. There were no words, just a soft inhale, a weight pressed behind the ribs. And then his eyes shifted. On the far edge of the wall, something unfamiliar caught his eye. It hadn't been there the last time. A simple bronze plaque mounted flush with the stone. No grandeur, no spotlight, just an engraving, firm and clean. "To those who stood for us and still do." Harold stood motionless, eyes fixed on the plaque. He didn't smile, didn't salute. His body didn't flinch or move. But within him, entire memories stirred. His breath quieted and he simply stood, shoulders squared, spine straight, heart full. It wasn't silence for the sake of silence. It was a moment of memory, of honor, of weight that couldn't be put into words. A few steps behind him, a young boy stood next to his father. The child's voice was soft, almost reverent, as he asked, "Is that him?" The father nodded. "That's him." Harold heard it. He turned just enough to meet the boy's eyes, gave him a small, knowing nod, an acknowledgement, quiet and full of meaning. Then he turned back and walked away, footsteps even, slow and sure. Because Harold Becker had never needed a spotlight. For him, it was never about applause or recognition. It was about standing when it mattered most, especially when no one else would. In a time when loud voices compete to be heard and noise threatens to drown out what truly matters, Harold showed a different path. One that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention. His dignity stood tall in silence. His strength was measured not in medals but in moments like this, where standing firm, alone if needed, was its own kind of heroism. Honor to Harold wasn't a title or a ceremony. It was a decision, quietly made, again and again, every day. And his story, though wrapped in the image of a uniformed man, is bigger than that. It speaks to us about what we hold dear as a nation, about the values that should never grow old: respect, courage, legacy. This isn't just a story about a veteran. It's a reflection on all of us, on what we choose to honor, on who we become when we're tested. In today's divided world where lines are drawn and beliefs clash, this moment asks us, what do we still hold sacred? Some might say it was just another protest, taken too far. Others might see it as a call, a plea even, to remember what we've let slip through the cracks. And maybe there are no easy answers, but maybe that's why we need stories like Harold's. Not to argue, not to rage, but to reflect, to talk, to listen. To all our older viewers, those who've lived through storms of their own, have you ever witnessed a moment when honor was challenged, when dignity was put on trial in front of the world? What did you do? We invite you to share those stories, not with judgment, but with understanding. Let this be a space where respect still matters, where silence still speaks. And if Harold's story touched you, if it brought someone to mind, made you pause, or stirred something within you, consider staying with us. Subscribe, like, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the most powerful act of courage is simply to stand, quietly, when no one else will. Thank you for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next story, where kindness meets courage and the ones who don't speak loud still lead.